Conservative MP-elect Jamil Jivani blasted Ontario Premier Doug Ford, accusing him of sabotaging the Conservatives' campaign.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has called for a reset to the relationship between Ottawa and her province following news that the federal Liberals won a minority government.
The National Post reports that Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet said that he's willing to cooperate with the Liberals for at least 1 year. Hello Canada, it's Wednesday, April 30th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Noah Jarvis.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. After being re-elected in the new Bowmanville-Oshawa North riding, Conservative Jamil Jivani took aim at Ontario Premier Doug Ford for being a, quote, hype man for the Liberals in the middle of the federal election. Jivani won the riding with 49.8% of the vote, while the Liberal candidate, Brigitte Girard, garnered 45.4%. During an interview with the CBC's David Common at an election night party in Jivani's riding, the Conservative MP-elect laid into the Progressive Conservative Premier for his negative comments about the Conservative campaign in the heat of the election. Jivani said, despite his dislike for how Ford, quote, managed healthcare or education, the federal Tories avoided commenting or interfering in Ford's jurisdiction and the Ontario election out of respect. Jivani said, quote, we didn't get in his way when it was his turn to run an election. He couldn't stay out of our business, always getting his criticisms and all his opinions out, distracting our campaign, trying to make it about him, trying to position himself as some kind of political genius that we need to be taking cues from. Jivani referred to comments made initially by Ford's campaign manager, Corey Tenike, who claimed Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's campaign was mismanaged and had blown a 20-point advantage over the Liberals. Conservatives still won over 40% of the popular vote. Before the election of Prime Minister Mark Carney as leader of the Liberal Party, many polls showed similar levels of support for the Liberals. The difference being that the Liberals saw a surge in support, particularly from NDP voters. Ford commented, saying if his campaign had run the federal election, the Conservatives would not have lost their lead in the polls. Ford later defended his comments, saying he was standing up for his campaign manager. Notably, Ford met with Carney right before the election was called, as no meetings between him and Poilievre have been publicly reported. So, Noah, were there any other ways that Ford had alienated Conservatives who supported the federal party?
Yeah, I mean, I think this starts off as an ideological split between the federal conservatives and the provincial conservatives. Doug Ford has been criticized by conservatives for not being conservative enough, not bringing down provincial spending, not doing enough to get rid of woke ideology from the education system, and not doing enough to reform the healthcare system. So Doug Ford has faced flack from conservatives on these policy issues, and the federal conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is a lot more solidly conservative in his values if you compare him to, say, someone like Aaron O'Toole. So I think that starts there. So Pierre Poilievre, whose campaign manager was Jenny Byrne, probably had no interest in going to meet with Premier Doug Ford after he was elected as the leader of the Conservative Party. And it took apparently a few weeks for Pierre Poilievre to congratulate Doug Ford on his 2025 election win. So it doesn't seem as if Doug Ford nor Pierre Poilievre were interested in reaching out to one another. It seemed like the feeling was mutual. And once the election started officially, you had Doug Ford staffers, as you mentioned, like Corey Tenike, who called the Pierre Poilievre campaign as just operating in campaign malpractice. These are some very strong and bold claims, especially since Pierre Poilievre's conservatives looks like they've captured about 41.5% of the popular vote, up from the roughly 33% that they captured under Aaron O'Toole. And it looks like they've actually garnered a greater share of the popular vote in Ontario than even Premier Doug Ford did in his election victory. It's just that the Liberals had shot up so high because the NDP, the Green Party, and some of the Bloc Québécois support had collapsed and gone to the Liberals. So this infighting, or not necessarily infighting, but this fighting between the provincial and federal conservatives really had bled out after Jivani had made those comments on the CBC. And I think he was speaking the mind of a lot of conservative voters. If you look at the CBC's coverage, just a few minutes after Jivani made that interview, Kate McKenna from the CBC, who was at the Conservative Party headquarters, said that there was cheering for Jivani's comments at the conservative convention. And that is likely because a lot of conservatives are upset with Premier Doug Ford's leadership. So I think that you're going to start to see some federal conservatives more vocalize these concerns. And perhaps you'll even see some provincial conservatives or former provincial conservatives like Roma Baber or some other new faces ditch the PCs and try to run in federal politics under the federal conservative banner. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's call for a quote reset with Ottawa after Prime Minister Mark Carney's minority government victory prompted some Albertans to flood her replies with demands to the province to separate from Canada. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's call for a quote reset with Ottawa after Prime Minister Mark Carney's minority government victory prompted some Albertans to flood her comments with demands for the province to separate from Canada. In a post to X on Monday, Smith congratulated Carney but warned that Alberta would not tolerate continued federal hostility. While extending her congratulations, Smith said that the last decade of liberal rule made the country weaker, more divided, and overly dependent on the United States. Conversely, she added that conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's vision inspired millions to see the unique potential of Canada. Smith wrote, quote, while liberals and New Democrats demeaned and demonized Albertans, our values, and our industries for political gain, Mr. Poilievre made empowering Albertans and our energy sector a cornerstone of his campaign. His respect and admiration for Albertans could not have been clearer. He is and continues to be a true friend of Alberta. She noted that the vast majority of Albertans are frustrated that the federal government, which has attacked her province's economy, has returned to power. Smith has previously cited various policies that hurt her province's and her country's economy, such as Bill C-69, the oil and gas emissions cap, the net zero car mandate, and the clean electricity regulations. The vast majority of replies to Smith's posts on X, Facebook, and Instagram saw Albertans calling for separation. The most liked comments on each post shared the same sentiment. Each post saw thousands of replies. The most liked reply to the post read, quote, it's time to stop with the Stockholm Syndrome, congratulating our abusers and celebrating our captivity in a rigged system. It's time to fire Ottawa. It's time to free Alberta. It's time for a full firewall. It's time to establish a rapid pathway to independent Alberta. With almost every reply called on Smith to explore separation, a very small portion of the comments were critical of Poilievre. Smith and Albertans would no longer tolerate having their resources stymied by Ottawa. So, Isaac, we've seen the rise of an Alberta separatist movement, or at least sentiment, in recent months. Has Premier Smith responded to the separatist movement in the past, and how has she replied to it?
Yeah, Noah, we've seen the separatist movement in Alberta pick up steam even before the election, especially as the polls suggested that Mark Carney would end up winning. And Albertans were warning Smith that they've had enough of Ottawa taking advantage of them, noting their willingness to separate if the disrespect from the East continues. Albertans have celebrated Smith for standing up to the feds in other instances, such as when she recently invited Quebec to fight federal overreach together. However, Smith seemed like she didn't want to get ahead of herself, as the separatist movement might have calmed down if Pierre won the election. Still, she previously committed to convening a panel to gauge Albertans' appetite for a referendum after the federal election. I'll remind listeners that the province could include a referendum at its next series of municipal elections in October this year. Former Premier Jason Kenney similarly conducted a referendum on equalization by including a constitutional referendum question on the municipal election ballot. But I have to be honest with you, Noah, this movement is much stronger than I anticipated. For example, when I was writing the article you just read through, I looked through all of the replies on Smith's X post, searching for somebody opposing Operation. And I scanned through the first 100 comments, the first 200. I couldn't find a single comment in opposition. I couldn't find a single reply opposing separation. Almost every single comment was in complete support of this movement. In fact, the only negative comment I found was one critical of Pierre Poilievre. True North will definitely stay on top of this referendum movement, and I'm excited to see how it develops going forward, especially concerning Smith's involvement. This train is starting to look like it may be too big to jump in front of. The last thing Quebecers and Canadians want is instability in the federal parliament, according to the Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchette, calling on his federal counterparts to drop partisanship and work hand in hand to fight US President Donald Trump's threats. Blanchette said, quote, I do not see any other scenario than collaboration for at least a year. He said this during a somber press conference the morning after an atypical election. When Blanchette spoke, the Liberal Party could still have won a majority of seats or collaborate with the left-leaning New Democrat Party to govern without fear of being overthrown. However, now it's looking like the minority is confirmed, but the latter statement of a coalition between the Liberals and the NDP remains true. The Separatist leader said he had already contacted other federal leaders to discuss the next steps in a possible minority parliament. Blanchette said, quote, in these results, there is uncertainty and the instability prevails. Quebec wants stability. Federalist parties and our party, which is an independentist party, should be working together in this crisis. We should not threaten to overthrow the government anytime soon. Canada is in the midst of a trade war with its closest ally, the United States. Trump has imposed tariffs on Canadian imports and has repeatedly threatened to annex Canada. Blanchette's comments come after he said last week that he felt like he was sitting in a, quote, foreign parliament and that Quebec was part of a, quote, artificial country with very little meaning called Canada. His comments were widely criticized outside of Quebec. So, Noah, what sorts of demands should Canadians expect if the Bloc Québécois decide to prop up the Liberals, or is it looking like the NDP could do that as well?
Well, the way the votes are being tallied up now, it looks like the NDP could prop up the Liberals, but a MP resigning here, a by-election flipping a seat there, and the NDP do lose the balance of power. But when it comes to the Bloc Québécois, they've been pretty clear about what sorts of demands that they are going to be asking of the Liberals. And they're all going to be centered around issues and items that A, benefit Quebec, and B, benefit the Bloc Québécois constituents. For example, probably going to be pushing for increased benefits to old people because a large amount of Bloc Québécois voters are old Quebecers, Quebecers who may have lived through the referendum days and still hold on to faint hope that Quebec could either separate or gain further autonomy. But speaking of autonomy, he's probably going to also ask for immigration reform, specifically devolving certain federal powers over immigration to the Quebec National Assembly, and they would like complete control over their ability to bring in immigrants, how many immigrants they'll be bringing in. They'll probably have a requirement that they speak French. Now, it is not clear that Carney's Liberals would give the Quebec National Assembly these powers, but he may feel like it is necessary if the NDP is not holding the balance of power anymore, or if they just withdraw their support because they might have wise enough from their confidence and supply agreement days. And also Quebec or the Bloc Québécois would probably prop up certain interprovincial trade barriers that are beneficial to Quebec. A key initiative that Mark Carney said he would be putting forward as Prime Minister is trying to bring the provinces together to eliminate all interprovincial trade barriers, but there are certain trade barriers that provinces put up because they believe it benefits their economy, and Quebec is no different. And because they are far more nationalist, they might view the effort to break down interprovincial trade barriers as an affront to their sovereignty, and thus fight the federal government over that. And you can expect the Bloc Québécois to represent that voice in Parliament. So it remains to be seen if the Bloc Québécois will actually follow through with their pledge to support the Liberals for 1 year, if the Parti Québécois in Quebec but wins their provincial election in 2026, there might be some tensions over the Bloc Québécois and the Liberals over a referendum that the Parti Québécois wants to put forward to separate from Canada. So there's a lot to cover for True North over the next few years, but it'll certainly not be boring.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating.